Thank you for joining me today. This is a personal essay on some thoughts about some things. So my last post was about it was an ode to the late Reverend Jesse Jackson, a man who was instrumental in my life in pointing me into the direction of politics. Yeah, so yeah, it's an interesting article. If you hadn't gotten a chance to see the video and read what I wrote about him last night, I did watch some of the highlights from his homegoing service at in Chicago, and I also saw a headline where somebody said that the Democrats hijacked his funeral. That's what Sabby Sab said. They hijacked it. So that means a couple of people got up there talking politics. And the person I did see at the podium was Sharpton and Harris and Biden. They shouldn't have been allowed to speak. But who am I? Who am I? Because Jesse Jackson couldn't have been a part of the today's Democratic Party. He was always pro-Palestinian. That's what I remembered. I don't know how he felt in recent years, but he was always pro-Palestinian, and that was one of the reasons why he was never going to become president of the United States. So, yes, the late great Reverend Jesse Jackson. Another thing I want to talk about is the YouTube series called Soft White Underbelly. And in watching that, it's like a ongoing documentary. That's what it is, because it's always about people who are just the people who have just the worst experiences in life. That's what it seems like to me. The producer of that show, he always asks people, where you from? What was your life like when you was a kid? And people just, once people start telling their story, they just go. And people do have some very interesting and riveting stories to tell. I find the stories compelling and thought provoking. I've always thought I had a hard life, but no, no, I didn't. No, ain't no way. Ain't no way I had a hard life when I listened to the lives that these people had, when they talk about what they've endured, what they had to go through. I just watched a story tonight. It's about Igor, who's an ER nurse, and the title is kind of misleading because it says necrophilia in the ER, but it's not like Igor was the one who was the necrophilia. But he talks about that, and he tells these really fascinating, shocking stories, of things that happen in the ER. And he's a young guy. He's young, 33. But he tells his stories, and apparently he's been on Soft White Underbelly more than once. But this is the first time I've seen him, so I'm going to go back and search out some of his other stories, because working in the ER is always like working under a full moon. I know it is. So he was an interesting person on on Soft White Underbelly, and I don't usually laugh when I'm watching that, but Ego tells the story in a way that makes it entertaining and shocking, and just like amazing stories. I've always been intrigued by stories. I can remember being told stories as a youngster, and just being at attention, rapt attention, because I was just always mesmerized by stories, whether it's my mother telling the story or my dad or the teacher in school. I remember learning about the story Native Son. Um, that's the story by Richard Wright, and the story about him being involved with the white woman, and he ends up killing her and stuff. And I remember somebody telling me that story long before I ever read it, and I was like, wow, somebody actually wrote that. Yeah. So I've always been taken with stories and to just sit and watch people tell their life stories and most of it is horrific. Most of what's on Soft White Underbelly is just bad, bad, bad. It's just no other way to call it. So I enjoy watching Soft White Underbelly because it's like watching a small documentary on a person's life. And there's one talking about the title is pedophiles are everywhere, and he talks about, oh my goodness, he goes on for an hour and a half about his sexual abuse and what happened to him, and he even named some guys who molested him. He said, yeah, and it was in New York. He lived in New York, and he said, oh, and the person he named was a police officer or a former police officer. Yes, so he talks about the pedophiles. He said they are everywhere, and he said, and see, I think that in looking at the thing with pedophilia, and this goes back to the stories about the serial killer that they called the Zodiac killer. The way he was close with that woman, and that woman had like 8 children, and he would take the children on trips, and he's in the room with the kids, and he did something to the oldest daughter, and people are too trusting with people that they think are nice, and they trust them with their children. And in that episode entitled pedophiles are everywhere, he talks about that. He talks about that, how ordinary looking people, you think they nice, you think that is, but people be trusting their children with really strangers, and sometimes maybe not so strangers, just family members, you know. But Soft White Underbelly does have some really mind-blowing stories, like the story by his name is Malik Pointer. When I saw it, it didn't even dawn on me that it was related to the Pointer Sisters, but he turned out to be the oldest son of Ruth Pointer, who's the oldest sister of the Pointer Sisters, the singing group from 1973. That was when they just busted out onto the scene, and I loved them with their vintage clothing and all. And he tells this horrific story about the Pointer Sisters. Mind you, all of the Pointer Sisters are dead except his mother, the oldest Pointer Sister. I believe she's going to be 80 years old this year. And he talks about how his father is one of the biggest pimps ever. Now, keep in mind, the Pointer Sisters grew up in the church. Their father was a preacher, but they were some drug addicts. Yes, they were. He tells the story. You don't have to take my word for it. His name is Malik Pointer. And so Ruth Pointer has a birthday this month, and she turns 80 or 81, something around there. Yeah. And she's still here. He says she was like the biggest of the dope addicts. Yeah. So it's a riveting story. When I was watching it, I was like, what? The Pointer Sisters? Yes. Ruth is the last one. She's the last Pointer Sister still here at 80 years old. So yes, so that's one of the stories on Soft White Underbelly. Well, that's another story. So there's Igor, there's the guy talking about his molestation story. And a lot of times people coming out about what's happened to them, it gives somebody else courage to come out and tell their story. So there's always somebody, on there talking about horrible incest, being addicted to some type of substance to the point of, like past the point of no return, and then being able to come back and tell the story. So it's very interesting looking at people's life story and hearing them tell it in their own words. You may always think that your life is so bad. Oh, my life was so bad. And then you hear somebody else's life. And I know I've heard some people's lives, and I know I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it. So some of it is very mind blowing, but it's true what they used to always say. In the city, there is like 3 million stories. No, it's more stories than that. Everybody's got a story to tell. That's the thing. And Soft White Underbelly kind of reminds me of the Humans of New York project that started some years ago. I imagine by now it's been going on for 10 years, but I first heard about the Humans of New York project on Facebook. And he would just have a picture. It would just be a picture of someone sitting on a park bench somewhere, standing on the sidewalk, posing in such a way. And he, I guess he must ask them a question, and then they start talking. And a lot of times people will be talking about trauma, some trauma in their life. And so over the years he managed to build up quite a collection of stories of people in New York. That's why it's called Humans of New York. And last year there was even an exhibit down at Grand Central Station. There was more stories about the Humans of New York, and other photographers was involved in this exhibit. I think that's what the crux of it was. And so all of them had that same slant where they was telling the stories with a photo, and stories are riveting. They are. If you have a picture of someone, and then but with that picture comes a caption telling their story, and most of the times people tell a story that's unbelievable, that's heartbreaking, that's trauma. But yeah, everybody has a story, and Soft White Underbelly just seems to have the worst of the story. So you should check them out. Yes, it's very interesting and it's riveting. Thanks for joining me this time around. See you next time.